And our next thing here, looking at the spinal cord, is going to be looking at the roots of each spinal nerve coming out. So I'll highlight those and we can take a look at that. So I think on your lab sheet, you should have a diagram of the spinal roots coming out of the spinal cord. So we have an anterior and posterior root, right? So at each section of spinal cord, we have these two roots coming out. So right now I'm looking at the 11th thoracic nerve and the anterior root, and then behind that is going to be the posterior root, sitting like that. And so these have different jobs. The posterior roots are going to carry sensory afferent fibers back to the spinal cord from things like the skin, subcutaneous tissue, deep tissue, visceral organs. And then the anterior root is going to send out motor efferent fibers to muscles. So different pathways for the roots, and they come together to form the actual spinal nerve. Okay. And also on your lab sheet, we have our favorite, the brachial plexus up here, formed from C4 to T1, right? Those big spinal nerves coming out of the cervical region. And as we talked about just now, the cauda equina, which is from L1 to S3, is going to be at the very end. And then just for reference, here's the vertebral column. It's just good to have that up there to give you a reference on where everything is, where everything ends. So keep all of that in mind. So that's the vertebral column. And so now we're going to look at the spinal cord vasculature. And we're going to see some similar things from last week, because we had talked about the circle of Willis and all the arteries that feed into that. Well, we do see three familiar longitudinal arteries, and they are going to be our spinal arteries. So we have that one anterior spinal artery that's going to run down the spinal column in front of the spinal cord. Okay, so we see that's running the whole length down the column in front. And then you can refer back to last week's video to see it up where it ends in the cranium, where it gets to the circle of Willis, right? And then in back of the spinal cord, we have our two posterior spinal arteries. So the anterior spinal artery is going to form from the union of the vertebral arteries that are in back of the circle of Willis. And then our two posterior spinal arteries are going to form from the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries that come off of the vertebral arteries. Okay. All right, so those are our first three. So now we're going to look at some new ones. These are going to be our segmental medullary arteries. So these are going to come off medially from the vertebral arteries. So right now I'm looking at the cervical spine. And with the cervical spinal vertebrae, we have the transverse foramen that go and that carry arteries and nerves down the sides of the neck. So our big vertebral artery here, and then we have these branches coming off medially, and these are going to be our posterior and anterior segmental medullary arteries. So here's just a good shot of them. So when these vertebral arteries have these branches poking into the intertransverse foramen, it'll break off into two branches. And so we have our posterior segmental medullary, and these are going to feed into the posterior spinal arteries. Okay, so we can kind of see on each side they come in, and then they are going to directly supply those two spinal arteries, those two posterior spinal arteries in back of the spinal cord. And then the other branch, which is going to go in front and feed into the anterior spinal arteries, are going to be the anterior segmental medullary arteries. And so these are going to come from those um, vertebral arteries medially within the spinal canal, and then they're going to feed into those spinal arteries. Okay, so that's our vasculature for the spinal cord. So next up on your lab sheet is going to be the cutaneous innervation. Let's jump down into the some more vessels, just to stick with a common theme here, for the superficial back. Okay, so we looked at the vessels for the spinal cord, and our first superficial back artery is going to be our transverse cervical artery. Okay, so as I like to do with any vessel, I think it's important to trace it back to a good reference landmark. So looking here right now, I'm at the level of the first and the second rib. And if I follow this artery back to this major vessel, this is going to be our subclavian artery. And as the subclavian comes off of the aorta, it has this trunk, which is our thick thyrocervical trunk. And so if we turn it around to look at it posteriorly, that superior branch to come off laterally is going to be the transverse cervical artery. So this is going to curl around posterior and then make its way down below the first rib to the level of the second rib in the back. And so this is going to end in two distinct branches. And you can't really pick these out in this program, but we can see that this ascending branch that then goes back up over the first rib is going to be our superficial branch. And then the descending branch that goes down to the second rib is going to be our deep branch. So ascending, superficial, descending, deep is a good way to think of it, I think, at least for me. So that's the only one in that section, but the professor may add these next few ones because she did want to go over a couple more for the superficial back. So that's our transverse cervical, right? So we then have three pairs of arteries and veins, which follow the same path, but obviously the blood's flowing in a different direction. So the first pair we're going to look at is going to be our dorsal scapular artery and vein. And these are pretty distinguishable because they run along the medial border of the scapula on each side. So to just follow it back where it came from, we have this branch coming off of the subclavian artery at the very end, and it branches off posterior, right around the level of the first rib. And then this will just descend down the whole medial border of the scapula. And the vein does the exact same thing, the same origin branch and the same exact path. Okay, so these vessels are going to work with the rhomboid muscles, the latissimus dorsi, as well as the trapezius, which we'll get into later. So that's our first pair. Our second pair is going to be the suprascapular artery and vein. So looking at the scapula, we have above the spine in the back, these branches. And so these are going to be our suprascapular arteries. These come off, just like the transverse cervical artery, off of that thyrocervical trunk. And this is going to be the branch lower than the transverse cervical artery coming off of that trunk. And this makes its way and branches out above the spine of the scapula. And we can see the vein right there next to it, so that's easy enough. And then the final vessel pair for the superficial back is going to be below the spine of the scapula, and this is going to be our circumflex scapular artery and vein. Now this is going to come off the subscapular artery, which, if we remember way back when we talked about the upper extremity lab, we saw this as a branch coming off of that axillary artery, which enters and runs down the humerus. So this is a posterior branch, the subscapular, and then an end branch of that vessel is going to be our circumflex scapular artery. And then the same thing, the vein is just its pair. So everything's the same for that. Okay, so those are our 4 vessels plus veins. So straightforward with that, but that covers the vasculature for the back that we need to know.